The notification came at 7,014 in the morning, and I almost didn't look at it. I was in the middle of my second cup of coffee, still in my pajamas, still half asleep. My phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. I assumed it was a spam email or one of those bank alerts telling me I'd earned 14 cents in interest. I swiped it open without thinking. It was from my brokerage account. A transfer confirmation. The under $12,000 moved to an external account at 6:58 a.m. I set my coffee down very slowly. Then I read it again. My name is Layla Beckett. I'm 31 years old. I'm a licensed occupational therapist. I work with pediatric patients, and I spend my days helping kids learn how to hold pencils and button their shirts and trust the world a little. I am, by most accounts, a patient and steady person. I don't panic easily. I don't make decisions when I'm emotional. But standing in my kitchen in my socks, reading that notification 3 times in a row, something in my chest went very, very quiet. I called my bank first. The representative confirmed the transfer had been authorized. When I asked how, she said the account had been accessed through online banking. The credentials matched. She sounded almost bored when she said it. I hung up and sat down on the kitchen floor, which is something I'd never done before in my life. That money was everything I had outside of my retirement fund. My mom died 4 years ago and left me a small life insurance payout. I had added to it every month since then, watching it grow the way she never got to watch me grow up past 27. That account had her initials written in the sticky note on my laptop case. It was hers as much as it was mine. And now it was gone. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I sat on the tile and thought very carefully about who had my login credentials. The answer came fast, and it didn't surprise me as much as it should have. My stepbrother. His name is Todd, and he's been a problem for longer than I've wanted to admit. When my dad remarried, I was 16. My stepmom came with a son who was 19 and already had the particular kind of confidence that belongs to people who have never had to work for anything. Todd was charming in that effortless way, the kind of person who could talk his way into and out of anything. My dad liked him immediately. My dad has always had a weakness for people who remind him of who he wanted to be at that age. For years I told myself Todd was harmless. He borrowed money and paid some of it back. He missed family dinners and showed up to others. He said things that stung and then laughed like they were jokes. He was never a villain in an obvious way. He was just someone I kept my distance from while pretending everything was fine at holidays. The real shift happened about 8 months ago. My dad had a mild heart attack in October. Nothing catastrophic, but enough to put him in the hospital for 4 days and come home with a list of medications and a strict diet and a new awareness of his own mortality. He recovered well, but he was shaken. We all were. Todd, I noticed, handled the situation by becoming very present. He came around more. He helped with groceries. He took my dad to a couple of doctor's appointments. My stepmom was grateful. My dad seemed comforted. I thought honestly that maybe something had shifted in Todd, that a health scare had reminded him what actually mattered. I was wrong. He wasn't showing up out of love. He was positioning. The first sign I ignored was when Todd asked me, very casually, what financial accounts I had set up. We were all at my dad's house for Thanksgiving, and he brought it up over the dishes like it was small talk, said he was thinking about getting more serious with investing and wanted recommendations. I told him the basics. Nothing specific, but I mentioned the brokerage account. I mentioned I'd been contributing to it for years. I mentioned the balance range loosely, the way you do when someone asks a polite question and you give a polite answer. I should have stopped there. I didn't. A few weeks later, he asked if I'd ever thought about consolidating accounts to simplify taxes. He knew a financial advisor, he said, a friend of a friend, someone really good. He could make an introduction. I said no thanks, twice. The third time he brought it up, I changed the subject. I thought that was enough. It wasn't. What I didn't know at the time was that my stepmom had quietly told Todd about a folder my dad kept in his home office. My dad, being of a generation that still prints things out, had a paper copy of important documents for every family member. Passwords, account numbers, emergency contacts, the kind of thing parents keep because they want to be prepared. Todd had found that folder. Auntie had found my login credentials. The brokerage platform I used had a known security gap that had since been patched, but at the time, if you had the username and the password, you could access the account and initiate a transfer to a linked external account with just an email verification. The verification email had gone to an address I'd stopped using, a college email I'd linked years ago and forgotten to remove. Todd had found that too. I don't know how. I stopped asking myself that question because the answer was never going to make me feel better. The morning of the transfer, while I was sleeping, he had moved everything. I sat on my kitchen floor for approximately 4 minutes. Then I got up, poured out my cold coffee, made a fresh cup, and called my lawyer. She picked up on the second ring, even though it was barely 8 in the morning. Her name is Renata, and she has the precise, unhurried way of speaking that I imagine surgeons have right before they make an incision. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Do you still have access to the account?" I checked. I did. "Don't touch anything," she said. "Screenshot every transaction log you can see. Then call your bank back and tell them you want to file a fraud claim. Don't use the word family. Don't explain the relationship yet. Just fraud." I did exactly that. And then I thought about the other thing I needed to do. I needed to not let Todd know that I knew. This is the part that most people don't understand about situations like mine. The instinct is to confront, to call and yell and demand an explanation, demand the money back, demand an apology. I understand that instinct completely. I felt it sitting on my kitchen floor. My hands were shaking when I made my coffee. But I had learned something from watching Todd operate for 15 years. He was good at talking. He was good at deflecting. He was especially good at making himself look like the reasonable one while making the other person look unhinged. If I called him that morning, he would have denied everything. And I would have been the hysterical stepsister making accusations, and he would have had time to move the money again, or spend it, or construct some story. So instead, I texted him. Just a regular, normal text. A picture of a recipe I thought he'd like because he'd mentioned wanting to try making chili. Nothing that would make him think twice. He responded with a thumbs up emoji. That was a Tuesday. By Thursday, I'd spoken to my lawyer twice more, filed the fraud claim with the bank, filed a separate report with the FBI's Internet Crime Complaint Center. Because the transfer crossed state lines, it qualified as wire fraud, and contacted a forensic accountant my lawyer recommended who had experience tracing transferred funds. I had also called my dad. This was the hardest part. My dad is 63 and he's still recovering from his heart attack, and he loves Todd in that particular way that step-parents sometimes love stepchildren, with the kind of deliberate effort that has over time become something real. I didn't want to hurt him. I also didn't want to lie to him, and I didn't want him unknowingly interfering while I was building my case. So I drove over on a Wednesday evening and I sat with him at the kitchen table and I told him what I'd discovered. I kept my voice even. I didn't editorialize. I just said, someone used my login information to transfer $300,000 out of my account on Tuesday morning. I have already contacted my bank and an attorney. I need to know if you have a folder in your office with my account information in it. He went very still. Then he got up slowly and walked to his office. I heard a drawer open. A long silence. Then he came back to the table and set down a folder and said, "It's been moved." He sat across from me and his hands were flat on the table, and he looked older than I'd seen him look since the hospital. "Layla," he said, "what do you need from me?" That was when I started crying a little. Not much, just enough to remind myself I was a human being and not just a project manager running a legal operation. I told him I needed him to let me handle it. I needed him not to call Todd. I needed him to write out exactly what information was in that folder and whether anyone had access to his office. He said yes to everything. He also told me that about 3 weeks earlier, Todd had borrowed his home office to make some calls and had been in there alone for about 45 minutes. There he was. My stepmom was harder. She reacted the way people react when someone tells them their child has done something that redefines everything. She went through 5 stages in about 15 minutes, starting with disbelief and ending somewhere around a fragile, painful silence. I didn't push her. I just told her what I told my dad. Let me handle it. Don't warn him. She called me the next morning and said, I'm sorry, whatever you need. Meanwhile, the forensic accountant had already traced the money. It had gone to a brokerage account in Todd's name, the same platform, a different account, and from there, $80,000 had already been moved to a separate account, this one under the name of a limited liability company Todd had registered in Nevada 3 months earlier. He had been planning this. That detail hit differently than the theft itself. The spontaneous, impulsive grab I could have almost understood. But a Nevada LLC formed 3 months in advance meant he had looked at me and my grief and my careful savings and decided deliberately, with full premeditation, that it was his to take. On Friday morning, 10 days after the transfer, my lawyer filed for an emergency asset freeze on the accounts where the money had been traced. The application cited wire fraud, unauthorized computer access under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, and conversion of personal property. It also named the Nevada LLC. The court granted the freeze by afternoon. That evening, I drove to my dad's house. Todd was there. He showed up for dinner the way he'd been doing every few weeks, comfortable and familiar, helping my stepmom set the table, telling my dad a story about a client meeting. He saw me walk in and said, "Hey," and then did a second look because something in my expression must have been different. "You good?" he asked. "Completely," I said. I sat through dinner. I ate my food. I talked about my week at work. A little girl who had finally managed to tie her shoes for the first time and burst into tears of relief, the way kids do when something clicks. I asked my dad how his blood pressure had been. I helped clear the plates. Todd relaxed. I watched it happen. His shoulders came down. His voice got louder. He started on a second helping. He thought he had gotten away with it. My phone buzzed under the table. A text from my lawyer. Court order served. Accounts frozen as of 4:47 p.m. today. I excused myself to use the bathroom. I stood in front of the mirror for about 30 seconds and took a slow breath. Then I went back to the table and sat down with my coffee. 20 minutes later, Todd's phone rang. He glanced at it, frowned, and said he had to take it. He stepped into the hallway. I heard his voice change almost immediately, the easy confidence drained out of it, or replaced it with something tighter, younger, almost like the voice of someone who had just realized the floor wasn't solid. He came back to the table and looked at me. "My brokerage account has been frozen," he said, "and something called Trident Holdings, which is—" "Your LLC," I said. "I know." The table went very quiet. Todd looked at my dad. My dad looked at the tablecloth. My stepmom had her hands wrapped around her mug. "Layla," Todd said, and his voice had that quality it always had, the one that meant he was about to manage the situation. "There has obviously been some kind of misunderstanding." "There hasn't," I said. I kept my voice even. It wasn't hard. I had been sitting on this for 10 days. "You accessed my brokerage account using login information you found in my dad's office. You transferred $312,000. You moved $80,000 of it into an LLC you registered in Nevada in August. I have the transfer logs, the access records, the IP address it was initiated from, and a forensic accountant's report. My attorney filed for a freeze this afternoon. The FBI complaint is already open." He opened his mouth. "I would strongly suggest," I said, "that you call a lawyer before you say anything else." He didn't speak for a long moment. Something moved across his face that I don't have a clean word for. Not quite remorse, more like the recalibration of someone who has just discovered that the person they underestimated had been 3 moves ahead the whole time. My stepmom was crying quietly. My dad still hadn't looked up. Todd left without finishing his coffee. The next 2 months were not easy. I want to be honest about that, because the way these stories sometimes get told, it sounds like once the villain is caught, everything becomes smooth and clean. It wasn't. There were days when the legal process moved slowly and I sat in my car after work feeling a particular kind of exhausted that has nothing to do with physical tiredness. There were conversations with my dad that were hard in ways I hadn't anticipated. He knew what Todd had done. He also loved him. Those 2 things existed at the same time, and neither one canceled the other out, and watching my dad navigate that was its own kind of grief. My stepmom stopped having Todd over for dinners. She didn't cut contact entirely, I didn't ask her to, it wasn't my place, but the dynamic shifted in a way that I think was permanent. Todd hired an attorney, of course. The attorney negotiated. Todd's position was essentially that he had intended to invest the money on my behalf and had planned to return the profits. This argument was not well received, partly because it was implausible and partly because the forensic accountant found that $30,000 of the money had already been spent on what the records showed as entertainment and travel expenses. He had spent $30,000 of my mom's money on a trip to Kabul and a very expensive watch. I let that sit in my chest for exactly one evening, and then I set it down because carrying it wasn't going to get my money back any faster. In the end, Todd pleaded guilty to one count of wire fraud and one count of unauthorized computer access. The plea deal included full restitution, all $312,000, plus interest and legal fees, to be paid back through a structured payment plan that would follow him for years. He avoided prison, which I had complicated feelings about, but the restitution terms were strict and legally binding, and his criminal record would surface in any background check for the rest of his life. His financial advisor career, which had been the whole point of the Nevada LLC, was effectively over before it started. The morning the plea was finalized, my lawyer called me on my lunch break. I was sitting in my car in the parking lot of the clinic, eating a sandwich, watching a pigeon try to figure out a vending machine. "It's done," she said. "You're whole." I thanked her and hung up and finished my sandwich. Then I drove back inside and spent the afternoon helping a 7-year-old named Marcus learn to use scissors. He had been working on it for 3 sessions. That day, something finally clicked. The angle of his wrist, the way he held the paper, and he cut a perfect zigzag line and looked up at me with an expression of pure, uncomplicated triumph. "I did it," he said, like he couldn't quite believe it. "You did," I said. I thought about my mom on the drive home. I thought about the sticky note on my laptop case. I thought about the fact that the money she left me was still there, still intact, still mine, and that no one had been able to take that from her or from me permanently, no matter how carefully they had planned. I don't know what Todd tells himself now. That's not something I can afford to spend time on. What I know is this: I kept my head when everything in me wanted to panic. I made the right calls in the right order. I let the process work. And at the end of it, I walked out with everything that was mine. They thought I would freeze. They didn't know I had already started moving. I keep thinking about that pigeon in the parking lot, the one trying to figure out the vending machine the morning my lawyer called to tell me it was over. There was something about watching that bird, completely unbothered, just working the problem, that felt like the right note to end on. People talk about betrayal like it's a single event, a door slamming, a moment you can point to. But what happened with my stepbrother didn't feel that way. It crept in through small things I talked myself out of noticing: a question about my finances at Thanksgiving, a casual mention of a financial advisor, 45 minutes alone in my dad's office. Each thing on its own was nothing. Together they were a blueprint. And the hardest part wasn't the theft itself. It was realizing that someone I'd shared holiday tables with for 15 years had looked at my grief, at the money my mom left me, and decided it was an opportunity. What I know now is that the outcome wasn't luck. It wasn't fate. It was a direct result of choices, his, and then mine. Todd made choices that assumed I would react the way people expect someone to react when they've been blindsided, emotionally, loudly, without thinking. He counted on that. He counted on me calling him in a panic, giving him time to move the money, giving him a story to build around. That was the flaw in his entire plan. He thought he knew what I would do, because he'd spent years watching me be patient and steady and unbothered, and somehow interpreted all of that as passivity. What he missed was the difference between calm and powerless. I didn't scream. I sat on my kitchen floor for 4 minutes and then I got up and called my lawyer. I didn't tip him off. I sent a text about chili. I kept my voice even at dinner while the freeze was already processing. Every choice I made in those 10 days came from the same place: the decision to think before I acted, to let the process work, to trust that doing the right things in the right order would matter. That's the part I want to hold on to, not the drama of it, not the satisfaction of watching his face change at that dinner table. What I want to remember is the discipline it took to stay quiet when I wanted to yell, to be strategic when I was scared, to protect my mom's money the same way she would have protected me by being smarter than the situation required and more patient than felt natural. My dad used to say that the people who come out the other side of hard things aren't the ones who got lucky, they're the ones who didn't let the worst moment make the worst decision for them. I didn't fully understand that until I was sitting on a tile floor at 7 in the morning, hands shaking, deciding what kind of person I was going to be in the next 10 days. Todd will be paying that money back for years, not because I was angry enough, because I was careful enough. There's a difference, and it matters more than I used to think.